Just to introduce myself, I'm one of the founding team at Senseon. So I've been at Senseon since the beginning, really, about 6.5 years ago. I won't be talking too much about us. I'm talking really about the problem. I'm talking about metrics and security operations, and hopefully you'll have some good insights into how you're managing your security operations team. My background's a practitioner. I'm not one of these people who's going to come speak to you who hasn't done your job before. I used to run security operations for EE. I used to ran the threat hunt team at BT, trying to find advanced APTs across their network. I'm all right for water, thanks. One of the coolest incident response jobs I've done was doing offshore security stuff, and there's a picture of me offshore in Egypt doing an incident response gig, which is very, very cool. Standard stuff, SysSysm, TOGAF, etc. And feel free to reach out to me or our email, LinkedIn, and we're over there if you want to chat to me afterwards. Today, we're going to be talking about threat mitigation, particularly in terms of some of the high-level metrics that you should be aware of and you should be applying to your defensive teams and your security posture. Going through brief-level definitions, we're going to be talking about what data there is or lack of data, and then we're going to be giving you some actual data which we've collected from our SOC and we've collected from a very small number of UK-based companies to kind of flesh this out a bit in terms of how fast you need to be. So we're really measuring the performance to contain a threat that your team finds in a network. And that's because as an industry, we keep talking about how fast adversary moves and how quickly we need to respond. But there's no real published metrics on how fast is acceptable, what is a good response time. Many of you have probably worked with like an outsourced provider, or you've done it internally and you leave incidents like that. When I was in EE, I basically banned my analysts from raising an incident after lunchtime on Friday because I knew it would be likely to cause all sorts of pain over the weekend. But like that's quite a dangerous and risky practice if you don't really know what you're doing and you're not good at triaging the triage of what are the most important things and when you should be react. Now, the only published stats we could find, which is coincidentally very, very easy to figure out, is CrowdStrike did say that teams have an average of 1 minute to detect attack, 10 minutes to understand it, and 1 hour to contain it, which is a nice round numbers, but there's no real analysis that we could find in terms of, is that appropriate, is that good, how fast are SOC teams in the UK acting and responding to these threats. So we're going to go through some real basic definitions, and that's because we're going to apply these definitions and these basic metrics to real-world SOCs, like actual SOCs in the UK. So we're going to be through 3 key metrics, and these are not intended to be intellectually stimulating metrics. These are the most basic metrics that we think every SOC team in the country should have. The first one is the mean time to acknowledge. And the reason why this is important is because some people will lie to you. Maybe some people here represent an MSSP or an outsourced MDR vendor, and they will start the time to acknowledge from the time it takes for an email autoresponder to respond to an email address. That is a lie. Do not measure those times. Measure when a human being actually starts working on the incident. Because when a human being, from an incident coming to the SOC to a human being picks it up, that is the actual time when it's actually being worked on and has been formally acknowledged by the SOC. So if anyone's doing any kind of SOAR automation, you need to remove the SOAR automation from your SOC metrics because that will trick your stats to think that you're doing far better than you are. Now, we measure these internally because it helps us internationally when we use a follow the sun model to figure out which shift is absolutely slammed or which shift isn't slammed. It also helps us as one of the metrics in terms of detecting our analyst motivation. If I have an analyst who responds really, really quickly, that's great. But if I've got one shift which doesn't have a lot of tickets, but is taking like an hour to respond, I know I've got a massive problem with motivation, potentially, at least in one of my individual areas, and we need to take action. So really very, very useful to kind of understand capacity and also kind of help figure out who's burning out, who's motivated, who's engaged. And that's because your best team and your best analysts will probably be doing cool stuff, and maybe they want to continue doing the cool stuff, but at the end of the day, I need them to investigate and manage alerts on behalf of my customers. The next one, again, very, very basic stat, is the mean time to investigate. And this is the time after the analyst has acknowledged it, from the analyst acknowledging it to the time that you can contain it. And this includes all of the remediation activity. It doesn't necessarily have to be, everything has to be restored, but you have to have contained the threat. And we take the average. Obviously, something involving a far bigger compromise may take us a bit longer. A lot of the things will be a lot simpler, but we take the average time. It also allows you to figure out capacity and capability issues in your SOC. I'll give you an example. Let's say you've got an alert within your team and you found some potential command and control. If you analyze your command and control time to investigate, you can figure out who's actually pretty bad at managing that across your team, who doesn't necessarily understand it because they might take longer, or even worse, if they're not doing a thorough investigation and they're closing those incidents down too quickly, that's also a really good indication that your analysts don't understand the threat enough or potentially don't have the right data in order to investigate it. So measuring the time to investigate across all your team members and the different types of incidents allows you to figure out in terms of both technology gaps and people gaps, which is super interesting to get to the bottom of. And that's because analysts are kind of working on all sorts of things, and generally, by the way, when I talk about our timings, analysts should only be working on one case at a time because it will skew your stats. You need to have analysts working on one case at one time. You can't have analysts working on multiple cases at a time until it's closed. And then finally, the sum of those two stats, the time to acknowledge and the time to investigate, comes together to the time to restore. And this is the most important metric. It's just the the work. The mean time to investigate is the time from the analyst starting work until the remediation action, and the mean time to respond, not recover, all the data protection people who are kind of getting angry that we're double using acronyms here. The mean time to respond, I'm confusing myself. The mean time to recover is the time it takes for, is the times it takes to completely remediate that. And this is ignoring all SOAR activity. So we got some private data from some people who run some fairly sizable SOCs in the UK. First one is a finance company. They have a managed SOC. They actually have some internal and externally managed organizations. They've got about 30,000 endpoints, so fairly sizable. Second one's a manufacturing company. Again, not a customer of ours. These are independent people that our SOC manager's private network was able to speak to and kind of get the stats from them. Around about 8,000 devices. Company C is a health-based company in the UK again. They've got about 2,000 devices, all managing internally in this case. And then finally, Senseon, we've added our stats here to kind of compare where we're at. And I've got the stats from the time we did that, and I can talk about how we've improved that and how we've changed that. So these are the stats with the MTTA, the mean time to investigate, and the mean time to respond, or the mean time to recover. And we've kind of looked at each one of those. And the first thing you can see, particularly against all the companies, is the mean time to recover is about the same. Like, it's pretty much the yellow bar is in the same ballpark. But looking at the first two, both the first two are outsourced organizations. And it's really odd. We found it very, very interesting that the time to acknowledge for one was 43 minutes, but then they actually only spent 8 minutes investigating. And then the other one, company B, which is the construction company, took 7 minutes to acknowledge. They acknowledged it really, really quickly, but they spent 40 minutes investigating. Now, we've got a few theories of that. We think that kind of variance in the time to acknowledge is potentially due to SLAs. So if you've ever dealt with an organization which measures and reports on SLAs or SLA failures, they will often respond within a couple of minutes of about to be an SLA failure. I've certainly used ticket management tools which would alert me to these things are about to breach the SLA, and that would be my priority. So they're working and focusing on meeting SLAs, not necessarily operating as fast as they need to, and we'll come on to how quick they need to be shortly. Also, it could be capacity issues. If you've got a team which is acknowledging, takes ages to acknowledge, straight away I think that kind of team's massively overburdened, they're oversaturated. If that was on all shifts rather than just one shift, I know I've got a huge capacity problem. That time to acknowledge probably only represents time on one shift, which is overburdened. So most of our customers are in the UK, so we have more analysts in the UK working on tickets, but when we drop to Australian hours, we have far less analysts working because we don't need that. We keep an eye on that time to acknowledge. That's really important. The next thing to kind of really focus on is if they're spending 8 minutes investigating on average, they might not be doing that thorough of investigation, especially depending upon the variance of tools that they've got across the estate. Let's say, we'll go through some examples of some real-world data in a minute, but they need to be understanding root cause in every single case. Maybe they're not. Conversely, with the customers who are kind of at 40 minutes, like that's quite a long time on average to be investigating on cases, especially when this is an organization with tens of thousands of endpoints. That is a very, very long time to spend 40 minutes on average investigating those cases. So I think those stats there have been driven not by the quality of the investigation, but by the organizations having to adhere to a 1-hour SLA to resolve those issues. At Senseon, our average kind of time to acknowledge is about 15 minutes. We've really focused on that. We've driven that down to about 8 minutes, and about 21 minutes is pretty average for our time to investigate. We'll go into that in a bit more detail. At the time, our kind of average time to resolution was around about 37 minutes. We've focused on that, and we've got that about 30 minutes at the moment. Right, couple of real-world stories. These have actually happened to our customers. All I've done is changed a couple of key technical details to protect the innocent, but these are with approval from our kind of anonymous customers, stories that we're going to go through. First customer is a construction company, fairly large organization, over $100 million in revenue annually. 500 endpoints in this customer are covered by Senseon, but we're not covering everything. We're only on a portion of their estate. And as a newer vendor, that's quite common. We need to kind of prove the value on part of the estate, and you'll find that in very, very large enterprises. They did have Defender for Endpoint, they had Senseon, but within the part of the organization we were in, we were only on one full-time equivalent for security. So how many people are familiar with Gootkit, Gootloader? Anyone familiar with it? No one. Wow, okay. Gootkit is I'll give you an example. So Gootkit is an attack which uses SEO poisoning. It is a particular malware variant we see a lot of in the UK. And basically, they target very, very niche search terms on Google. So, for example, they targeted the search term Section 33 Agreement, Local Government Act 1982. It's not going to be something which is searched very, very often, but they will poison the result on Google for a very, very niche term. Normally, it'd be the kind of terms which your legal and your finance and your procurement teams might have to Google or search, and they will target those results on Google. What they will do is, on that page, looks completely innocuous. This is an actual real Gootkit attack, not the one that we saw on the attack, but this is another one we've seen on another one of our customers. The user will then download a zip file. Inside that zip file is a JavaScript file, and then that JavaScript file, when they double-click it, will execute on the endpoint. We really focus with our end users of being like, don't run executable. So most users are paranoid about looking for .exes and things like that. If an end user sees a JavaScript file, they're probably not even aware of what it is. They're probably even not aware that's an executable or could execute on that user's endpoint. Additionally, with most web filtering technologies these days, most web filtering has horrific JavaScript moving about. If you've ever looked at any kind of single-page application these days, they all look malicious. They all are heavily compressed JavaScript. They're all potentially dehydrated JavaScript. It's an absolute nightmare trying to analyze any of these pages because we heavily compress JavaScript, which is a nightmare. So this stuff can get through web filters really, really easily. So in this case, we actually see it come down, and you can see at the bottom it being executed with wscript.exe. wscript.exe allows you to run JavaScript locally, and the attacker, through this niche search term, has bypassed the WAF and got remote code execution on the endpoint. So this is the timeline that we saw with a customer. And we weren't, like I stressed, we're not deployed on everything on this network. We're only deployed on about 500 endpoints on part of their critical infrastructure, but not all the end user devices. Now, the attack came in 9:22 in the morning. They infected a device which we weren't running on. But we did see scans coming from it. So after the infection, we saw some network scanning. We saw things like scanning on SMB, which is TCP 445, coming across the network. And we did raise a case. But if anyone's tried to manage any kind of security tooling at scale, like a IDS, IPS, looking in things like NetFlow logs, you'll know scanning goes on all the time. It happens every time someone runs a printer or tries to add a printer. It goes on all the time. It's really, really common. Then the attacker did some enumeration activity on that local endpoint, and they pulled out things like the NTLM hashes or the authentication details from those systems. The attacker then took those creds, did an offline attack to try and figure out what usernames and passwords they could guess, and they were able to successfully find the password for the domain administrator account. The attacker didn't do anything that day. The machine was off. The next morning, well, overnight, they cracked the password. It was quite a simple password for the domain admin account. The attacker comes back in at 7:12 in the morning, and then we see, well, we don't see it, but there's command and control coming from that device. Then, at 10 past 8 in the morning, we see a log on to the domain controller for this customer. And then at 8:14, 4 minutes after we see that log on, we have enumeration activity. We have things which appears to us like a threat actor attempting to take over this domain controller. Well, they're already on it. They've got on a domain admin account, and they've got access to the domain admin, and they're on the DC. They're about to kind of crypto locker at this customer. We raise this to the customer at 8:52. We'll go through the analysis time, but the time we've got from being on the DC to raising a case was 4 minutes. And then if you look at the timeline in terms of how quickly you have to move, it's very, very, very quick. We'll go through that in a bit more detail shortly. Now, we're in a really difficult position at this point because this customer had told us, I want you, before you take any action, I want you to call me. Now, we know right now that there is a threat actor on their DC. From the information we've got in that 1 hour analysis period, we're pretty sure this is a threat actor who's going to perform ransomware, so they're going to crypto locker this customer's entire DC. But we have to have the authority from the customer in order to kill this. Hands up if you would kill. We called the customer, no answer. We were trying for, at this point, 8 minutes, and we were trying repeatedly, every phone number, every email. We couldn't get hold of them. We know the customer's got multiple DCs. Who's going to isolate that device or start remediation activities at this point? Is anyone going to do that? Yeah, it's mixed. So we decided, we know this customer really, really well. We speak to them all the time. We knew they had multiple domain controllers, and we were at this very, very difficult point of this customer is about to get absolutely hosed. We made the decision, after 8 minutes of trying to reach them, that we were going to isolate 11 minutes after trying to reach them, that we were going to isolate the endpoint. We hadn't heard back from the customer. It was a really, really tough call at the time. It was made by the SOC manager, Callum. I'll come to you in a bit. But yeah, it was a real, real tough call. The customer was very, very happy with the decision. And there's a real balance in terms that we'll come on to of why you need to give the SOC authority and why now we have far more robust decision trees agreed in advance exactly for these types of situations. But really, really tough call by the SOC. We'll come on to that in a minute. Isolated 903 and kind of went through the activity afterwards. And just to kind of show you the kind of things that your SOC, this is our tooling. You'll have very similar output for whatever tools you've got, but these are the kind of alerts that your team will get. Like, for example, we saw PowerShell making connections to weird French IP addresses. We saw PowerShell going out to Vietnamese. We saw PowerShell execution bypassers kind of running random PowerShell scripts. Like, your SOC needs to be able to get these, understand them, and respond and contained within 24 hours, particularly starting at 8 a.m. in the morning. Otherwise, it would have been too slow for that. So, this is just one example where you need to respond realistically in under an hour, because that's how quickly adversities will move across it. And really importantly, and a lesson learned for us, was make sure we have very clear decision trees with every single customer, in every single situation on what we can and what we can't do. And now that includes waiting times for those paths in terms of if we do need to deal with an incident at 3 a.m. in the morning, what can we do if we see another adversary in the domain controller? Really, really tough. Customer's very happy. That was based upon our existing relationship and knowledge of the customer, because we speak to them literally every day, but very, very, very kind of tough call that we had to make. And thankfully, it all worked out, and there was no loss of service, and we managed to kind of find and remediate that threat actor across the network. And also, with your team's capability, you need to make sure your analysts who aren't dealing with this every day, when they start to see these, can make the right judgment calls. Have you got the right tooling? Have you got the right experience within your team to deal with this and investigate within that time period? Kind of another one is we had a medical device customer, we still do. Revenues over $1 billion, absolutely colossal in the healthcare industry. They're on around about 10,000 endpoints. Again, we're not on every part of the customer, we're on a good portion of them. They had some legacy antivirus, some SIEM, and they got around about 10, a security team of about 10. By the way, the last example was on another vendor. This starts off with another vendor as well. The attackers who are going to break in your network, like they literally have access to the same defensive tools you can do. Like if they're going against a large enterprise, they know you're probably going to have an E5 license. And often, these adversaries will use those tools, they will test them, they will see what works, they will see what detects and what doesn't. So just bear that in mind. Don't necessarily kind of put all your faith in one tool or one provider. How many people are familiar with Cobalt Strike? Not that many? Cool. Cobalt Strike's a kind of adversary emulation platform. It allows you to, it's used by red team operators to pretend to be an obvious or a discrete adversary. It's commercially licensed, but there's cracked versions available if you know where to look. This should be the number one thing your team should be focused on finding because it's so prevalent. We see it all the time. Now, this customer, we were deployed on this endpoint. We had the EDR enabled. We didn't have file scanning enabled, so we didn't have the antivirus component. That was handled by Microsoft Defender Plan 1, but Defender Plan 2 wasn't enabled on this. At 5 to 2, the user plugs in a USB drive. We then see some unusual executables being run from there. They're called EU.exe. And then we raised a priority case in our platform at 2:17. And we raised a case not because we were doing file analysis, but because we saw some what's called weird parent-child relationships in terms of processes. So things like PowerShell was trying to reach scheduled tasks. We saw persistence. We saw other activity that we thought was quite unusual. Then we see some automatic enumeration of the environment. And coming out of that, we see beaconing. So when you infect an endpoint, you have to remotely control it. And beaconing is when a connection is made externally to allow the attacker to kind of remotely access that system. We then isolated this device before we'd contacted the customer. Luckily, we had a pre-agreed decision tree based upon what we can and can't do in that case, which meant we didn't need to deal with this communication delay where it took our analyst 15 minutes after isolating to contact the customer because the analyst has to be coherent, proofread things, get all the right evidence in the right spot. That takes time, especially when the analyst is trying to contain something. So the analyst was able to contain it, thankfully, in about 40 minutes or so, 30 to 40 minutes from the machine occurring, and then we escalated it to the customer. We'll go through that lateral movement, and we'll go through what your analysts need to be able to see and understand in that time. Later on, we got the USB, and we've done some analysis, which isn't for today, unfortunately, because I will run out of time. So what does it look like? What are our analysts kind of analyzing? So you can see Explorer running in the top left. That's the parent. Explorer run the Windows command line. And from the Windows command line, you can then see some real kind of terrible enumeration to kind of see whether they're running in a sandbox. It's a really shocking way they kind of ping 127.0.0.1 to see if they get a response. But then we see them attempting, you'll see them down the bottom, they attempt to launch the Windows Error Management Reporting Service. Now, what they do with that is they then hollow the process, so they then appear to do everything as the Windows Error Reporting Manager. That's because if an analyst sees it, and they see something like this, an analyst might be like, oh, the Windows Error Reporting Manager is running whoami.exe, which is a process that you run to figure out what user you're running at. It's doing enumeration. Maybe it's trying to pretend that it's creating an error report, which is perfectly acceptable. You can then see it run other commands like netgroup, figuring out what domain they're on, figuring out other parameters, who are the admins on the system, where are the domain controllers, and then all of this data gets sent externally. So about 4 megabytes of data was then sent externally, and we see further enumeration running on the system that I won't go through now in terms of what software they're running, in terms of the anti-spyware or anti-malware products. But all of this is classic enumeration, which there's nothing here that in these kind of scenarios that your analysts, if they're investigating a serious compromise, they should know what this looks like. They should be able to understand this to be able to respond quickly and effectively. So in terms of that timeline, that's another one we're able to respond to in under an hour. And I think both scenarios show that by the time an actor starts poking your domain controller, it's probably approaching the too late point. And you've got a very, very short window in order to actually respond and contain this threat. About an hour is what we see from a competent adversary, particularly an adversary who's on the keyboard at the other end at that time. It will take that amount of time to kind of get the creds, understand the environment, and then move across the network. The first example was a ransomware actor, and the second example was actually something called an initial access broker. This is someone who breaks in, understands the network, gets a very, very kind of deep footing in your network, and then will sell the access to someone else who will then come into the network and potentially steal your intellectual property or crypto locker it. This came from USB storage, so a lot of organizations may need to use USBs, unfortunately. Like that's depending on the type of business you are. So making sure they're controlled. It's an old basic thing, but we see so many malware infections actually coming from USBs, particularly ones which I know some manufacturing companies will have like systems that they will have to plug into using USB processors. They will have engineers visit. Infections will come that way. And then in summary, so really, really important that when we look at the stats of our team, that you need to measure your performance, measure your SOC outputs. I've seen far too many vendors and far too many customers talk about MITRE ATT&CK framework coverage and really focusing on getting that framework completely green in terms of we can find every attacker tool and technique. That's good, but you actually need to respond quickly and effectively and have analysts on your 24/7 team being able to, from an alert occurring to responding and taking containment actions in under an hour, which is a fairly difficult task, I think, for most teams. Also looking at real-world stats, and when you look at all the information that's out there publicly, going, based upon the times and the information I can gather, there's very, very little. How would my team be able to respond on that? Would they have enough information to respond as quickly as they could within that time? Particularly that kind of 1 hour window, which 2 examples kind of show that was kind of a very good time to respond to. And in that example, it could have taken them a bit longer. They could have been resident for a while and attacked even more systems, but 1 hour was kind of a key. Gone through a few of the technical controls. Finally, kind of empower your team to kind of make sure that they can make decisions, that you've got decision trees set up on a 24/7 basis. If your SOC manager, you don't want to be in a position that we were, where your SOC manager is unable to contact the right people to make a decision, and sometimes even bringing the right people in the business together to make that call takes time. That can take 15, 20, 30 minutes or even longer, because these incidents will occur at really awkward times. So you need in advance to agree a decision tree of certain situations, of what they can do, what their limit of authority is, but please make sure they have the ability to at least isolate or contain, and they don't have to speak to someone who isn't in the 24/7 team, because you need to move really, really quickly, and you don't want to be in some awkward legal, commercial problem if you get that wrong. And then finally, go back in terms of what's allowed, who's allowed to communicate what, but that is broadly it. I'll be outside. I don't think I've got 2 minutes for questions before they kick me off and the next people come in. So I'll take a couple. Is there any questions from anyone? Go on. The French one? Was that the first one? We tried. It was early in the working day for them. We contacted them multiple times, but we just couldn't. There was nothing we could do. We were trying. Yeah. Okay. The first one to see it. Yeah. Yeah, and incident response in any global company is a real challenge, especially with the challenges and working hours, which is why that decision tree is really, really important in terms of what your SOC can and can't do. Did someone have one down here? No, go on at the back, sorry. That was based upon stats from the last 12 months by those organizations. So, yeah, the last 12 months. I don't have how many incidents made up from that. I know in terms of hours, it would have been in the thousands of tens of thousands that we took for that average. I can't speak for these organizations. We asked for their average of the last year, but I don't know the overall number of volume of actual incidents we used to generate that. Cool. Any other questions? I've got to go on. Sorry. the reason why we have a decision tree is to enable the SOC manager to, or whoever's doing incident response at the time, what their limit of authority is. So do they have the permission to potentially take down part of the organization to protect the wider organization? Taking a domain controller offline is a pretty necky challenge for an incident responder. They could potentially bring down parts of the organization and prevent that organization from running. Sometimes you might prevent the organization from doing business, which is the last thing you want to do. But if your customer data is about to leak, that's a really, really tough decision. And I've got to wrap up there, so I'm out of time. They're kicking me off. No worries. Thanks. I'll speak to you outside. Cheers.